First things first, wow, what a great turnout for the first debate of the year. So give yourselves a round of applause for coming out for this. This is incredible. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Buri Samard. I'm currently a 3L here at the University of South Carolina, Joseph F. Rice School of Law, and I am proud to be the president of this fine organization. What we're here to do tonight is to discuss a controversial topic in today's society, and we have chosen a provocative wording intentionally. This is not to stir inner emotions with you to hate your fellow citizen, but rather this is to point out the absurdity of the positions that we find ourselves in society. So if you found yourself with a little bit of excitement or anger or kind of confusion at times, that was intentional, but it was to point out that absurdity. But before we continue with this evening, I want to first give a thanks to all the individuals who have made this evening possible. So first and foremost, I want to thank Whitney Bedard here at the school and Chanel Singletary. Without them, no student event here would be possible, including ours. So if we could just go ahead and give her and their entire department a round of applause. I would also like to thank Dean Hubbard for his continued support here. I found out after the summer break that he plugged this event to our incoming 1L class, and that was extremely exciting to hear because it goes ahead and sets the tone for the incoming class that we respect civil discourse here. I also want to thank our advisor, Professor Laura Lane Steele, for her continued support. She is not only our advisor, but she's also a fellow of the society, so to have her here is amazing as well. There are several others, including Professor Chambliss, for her support with funding these events. We would not be able to have our food and drinks afterwards without her, so thank you so much for that. And for all of our fellows that have come out this evening, thank you for your continued support with the society and your engagement. The society is predicated on the idea that there has been a breakdown in conversation between individuals. Our goal here is to begin that process and fixing it. We are going on to our third year of our debates. We are going on to our third year of continued support of our community, and we believe that we're making an impact not only here, but also on the national stage. We've had other chapters formed at Cornell. We've received recognition from the ABA through the Gambro Award, which was an amazing opportunity for us to have won that. And we are excited to continue to grow by expanding to other chapters and to continue to leave our mark, not only here in South Carolina, but across the United States. So with that being said, I don't want to belabor the point, and I want to go ahead and get us into this evening's discussion. So Grant, if you could go ahead and introduce our topic here.
All right, that's better. Thank you all again for coming out. Give me a minute here so we can get the slides correctly changed over. And again, we're just so excited to see this turnout here tonight. This is absolutely fantastic. As Buri said, the society is predicated on the idea that we're speaking to each other, but we're not speaking. Oh, I didn't mute the screen, did I? But here it is. We have it all fixed now. All right. Well, the society is predicated on the idea that we no longer speak with each other, we speak to each other. And so we're excited to try to change that. But since we're at a law school here, we need to define our terms. And I want to speak a little bit to what the topic will be tonight, so you can know what to expect going forward. So the topic inclusivity in schools is more important than religious sensitivity. It was really inspired by a Supreme Court decision that came out a few months ago called Mahmoud v. Taylor. Now, the background of this case was the Montgomery County School Board in Maryland determined that LGBTQ characters were not represented sufficiently in its elementary school English curriculum. And so what they did to rectify that is they added a number of LGBTQ and inclusive books to their elementary school English curriculum to intentionally fix this underrepresentedness that they found. And what they also decided is that they would not provide parents any advance notice, and they would not provide parents with the opportunity to opt their children out of lessons with those books if they so chose. And there were some parents who weren't happy about this, and they sued, as individuals do. 3 sets of parents, Muslim, Catholic, and Ukrainian Orthodox, filed suit. and they argued that this violated the First Amendment. Now, even for those of us who haven't gone to law school, we probably have heard of the First Amendment. The relevant part here is the provision that says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And so that's what this court was faced with. They were faced with, on the one hand, schools, the Montgomery County School Board, that wanted to be intentional about fostering inclusiveness and representativeness in its curriculum. And on the other hand, parents who argued that the First Amendment gave them a right to opt their children out. Now, this is how the court handled it. What the court said, first of all, is that the First Amendment gives parents the right to direct their children's religious upbringing. The court said that's part of the First Amendment. And what they said, therefore, is that governments cannot, in their words, substantially interfere with children's religious development. Next, the court went to look at the specific books that Montgomery County School Board was using. And what the court decided was that the books were designed to convey a particular viewpoint. And what they also concluded was that because of the age of the children and because of the educational setting, that the use of these books exerted a pressure on children to conform to that particular viewpoint. And for that reason, the court said that this policy of the board to include these books without an ability for parents to be notified or opt out interfered with children's religious development and thus violated the First Amendment. So that's a basic backdrop of the case. And I don't want to go into any more depth because both of our speakers on both sides are going to give us their own explanation of it and do a fantastic job with that. But what we do in these debates, if you haven't had the opportunity to come out to one, is we start out by giving you the opportunity to decide. So what we do is, you haven't heard the speakers yet, but if you would just take out your phones and scan the QR code, and if you don't have a phone, if you'd rather a paper ballot, we have some paper ballots, just raise your hand and we'll come bring you one. But what we would ask you to do is either select yes, you believe that inclusivity is more important than religious sensitivity. In other words, you believe this court should have ruled for the Montgomery County School Board, you believe the Montgomery County School Board was in the right, or no, that you believe the court was right to prioritize the parents' religious exercise over the public school's attempt to foster inclusivity. And so you have the option to vote yes, no, or maybe, and feel free to vote maybe. You haven't, or unsure, you haven't heard the speakers yet, and we didn't bring these speakers out for nothing, so we certainly encourage you to do that if you see fit. But just give everyone a chance to do that. I'll give a few moments for that. And while I'm doing that, I'll go ahead and explain the course of this debate. So to kick us off is we meet Professor Brown of the University of South Carolina School of Law. He's going to be followed by Miles Coleman, a partner Nelson Mullins. We're then going to have Denise Strickland, 2L here at the law school, speak, and then we're going to have Chandler Huskey, and then we'll finish off with a rebuttal from our two headlines, Professor Brown and Miles Coleman. So if everyone's gotten a chance to scan, no one needs a paper ballot. Then I'm excited to kick it off. Let's welcome Professor Brown.
Hello. I want to first start by introducing opposing counsel, Miles Coleman, who's a partner at Nelson and Mullins. He practices in the areas of appeals, business litigation, and First Amendment law, and represents and counsels private entities and government agencies and officials on issues relating to constitutional and statutory freedoms of speech, religion, and association. And Chandler Huskey, a wonderful student of mine, is a third-year law student here at the University of South Carolina School of Law. Chandler's a former vice president and president of the Federalist Society and a former senior articles editor at the South Carolina Law Review. So we should give them a hand of applause to welcome them. Wow. This case. The court's decision in Mahmoud upsets the long-time balance. The court's decision in Mahmoud upsets the long-time balance that existed regarding how to resolve conflicts between values in public schools and those of religious adherence. Any discussion of the implications of Mahmoud case must start with the recognition of the lack of judicial support for the expansive free exercise right the court recognized. The majority opinion written by Justice Alito primarily relies on two prior Supreme Court cases. First is the 1943 opinion in West Virginia versus Barnett. In the opinion, the court addressed a challenge to the application of the requirement that all public students, including Jehovah's Witnesses, say the Pledge of Allegiance. While Alito discusses the cases if the court's decision rested upon an interpretation of the free exercise right, the court in West Virginia actually rested its decision on a broader principle that made the right a right that applied regardless of religious beliefs. Indeed, 3 years earlier, the court had expressly rejected a free exercise challenge to the pledge by the Jehovah's Witnesses in Minersville School District versus Gobitis. Indeed, this is what necessitated the court finding a different First Amendment right in Barnett. The second opinion that the majority relies heavily upon is the 1972 opinion in Wisconsin versus Yoder. But for the past 50 years, constitutional experts and courts have generally accepted that Yoder was an opinion limited to the unique factual situation of the Amish. The court in Yoder noted that few other religious groups or sects could make the claim that the Amish are making. In several passages, the court stresses the fact that the Amish have unique special circumstances. They have a 300-year history of being law-abiding. The Amish live an ordinary life that is separate from the mainstream world. Thus, Amish students are only being prepared to live in isolated, homogeneous communities. Another important distinction is that the free exercise right exempting the Amish children from compulsory school attendance beyond the 8th grade did not provide the administrative burdens that the free exercise right the court found in Mahmoud does. In other words, the court has never come close to recognizing the position adopted in Mahmoud, and the mere exposure of objectionable ideas could carry with them a very real threat of undermining the religious beliefs that parents wish to instill is a statement that the court had never made before. But regardless of the weakness of the legal support for the court's opinion, Mahmoud is now governing law, and not to put a crink in this debate, but as I said to the organizers repeatedly, inclusivity, or the I in DEI, always included religious sensitivity. Thus, I never really saw a conflict between the two. But having said that, I will focus my criticism on the opinion and the implications of recognizing this robust free exercise right that Mahmoud has created. When Yoder was decided in 1972, America did not have the magnitude of the religious diversity that we have today. This was due in large measure to the bans on immigration from the Middle East and Asia that were in place from around 1920 until 1968. Now there are over 370 religious sects in the country. Providing religious adherents these kinds of free exercise rights raise serious questions about how much of public education could be disrupted because of the decision. For example, most Hindu religious adherents believe in a caste system. The caste system is a hierarchical system that completely rejects the American idea of equality. The higher one's caste, the more religious merit one obtained in prior incarnations that led to this privileged birth. Outcasts are those at the bottom of the caste system. They are considered religiously polluted, and this pollution is contagious. Thus, parents of high caste children could assert that their religious liberty demands that their children be segregated from the children who they view as infected with a certain religious pollution. There are the Muslim sects that don't believe women should be educated. When Yoder was decided in 1972, it was very clear it did not apply to Muslims. What about now? The Mormons and other Christian sects, including some Southern Baptist sects, used to believe that black people did not have souls. If this is a core religious belief sincerely held by a parent, does this mean that they can object to a considerable amount of curricular material that presents black people in a positive light? Or can they assert that their children should not be forced to share space with soulless people? The Nation of Islam believes that white people are inherently evil, that since black people are the original people, for the nation, the origin of white people comes from the selective breeding program that was created by the evil scientist Yaqub. His breeding program produced successively lighter-skinned people who, because of their lack of color, were more prone to disrupting the societal order. What free exercise rights should we grant to them? Indeed, I don't even have to go outside of the margins to point to the concerns about this right. The majority argues that exposure to these books carry with them a very real threat of undermining the religious beliefs that parents wish to instill. Thus, can religious adherents of various faiths object to positive portrayals of women as astronauts, scientists, or politicians, or black people as law professors, lawyers, or financial analysts? I could go on, but I hope by now you see the point. The court's decision also has upset the long-term understanding about the balance between public education and religious adherence. Generally speaking, most children attend public schools 6 hours a day, 180 days a year. Thus, children only spend 1/8 of their total time and only 1/6 of their waking hours in public schools. This means that the overwhelming majority of their time, parents have the opportunity to teach their children about their religious beliefs. But if children are to choose their own religion once they are adults, they must be exposed to religious ideas that are inconsistent with those of their parents. In addition, for a century, it's been clear that religious adherents who disagree with the values of public education could either enter the political process and try to produce more favorable, responsible administrators of public education, or send their children to private schools. Obviously, the former is a problem for minority groups like LGBTQ community. Indeed, one study points out that nearly 2/3 of LGBTQ students feel unsafe in school because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. One can certainly expect that this is going to increase given this decision. But resort to the political process is not a problem for monotheistic religious adherents who collectively are a majority in our society. Indeed, in the most recent school board election in Montgomery County, the subject of this litigation, 3 of the 7 members were voted off the board. In other words, monotheistic religious adherents don't need the protection from the majoritarian political process the LGBTQ community members do. And as for the ability to send someone's children to private schools because of religious objections, this is precisely how we developed the Catholic school system. Given that 5 of the 6 justices in the majority were Catholics, one can't help but wonder how much their religious beliefs may have influenced this particular decision. Beyond these kinds of objections, the court's decision undercuts the dominant conception of public education. That is, it's there to advance society's notion about how children should be socialized so that they could become full-fledged adults and citizens with rights and responsibilities. In that regard, several Supreme Court opinions have stated that the primary purpose of public education is the inculcation of fundamental values necessary for the maintenance of our democratic way of life. In a society like ours that values individual self-determination, there will be law-abiding individuals who embrace beliefs and lifestyles that others find objectionable. Thus, the Supreme Court has recognized that one of the fundamental values is tolerance for diverse beliefs and points of view. But there is a chilling effect that this ruling will have. Many risk-averse educational officials and their lawyers will simply decide to delete material about the LGBTQ community from the curriculum. Even material that doesn't run afoul of this right, although admittedly it might be hard to figure out what that is. This opinion will make inculcating tolerance of LGBTQ lifestyles far more difficult, if not impossible. How does one learn to tolerate alternative lifestyles if you never have your beliefs that they are objectionable challenge. And what is worse, the impact on the young children who are from the LGBTQ community, who see their classmates go off into different rooms when issues that touch their lifestyles are presented. It used to be that we cared about such impacts on all children. Now it's clear we care about it only on the right kind of children. Also, how can you have a democracy that is based on the free debate of ideas if individuals are shielded from being exposed to ideas they disagree with and because of their religion? But then beyond the religious issues, does this new right provide parents to go even further? As discussed, the court ruled in West Virginia versus Barnett that the right there applied to all students, not just religious students. And for West Virginia right to survive the Supreme Court's 1990 decision in employment services, the court had to note that the right there rested on the combined rights, including the constitutional right of parents to control the upbringing of their children. If religious parents can decide what aspects of the curriculum their children should be exposed to, what about parents asserting their constitutional right to control the upbringing of their children, other than dealing with aspects of religion? These parents could object to their children being exposed to certain types of racial, ethnic, or gender issues, regardless of their religious beliefs. Indeed, one could easily argue that it is more important for parents to have control over issues of race, ethnicity, or gender than it is to have control over religious issues. After all, it's possible that a child as an adult will change their religion, but a child cannot, as an adult, change their race, ethnicity, or gender, at least given our current technology for the overwhelming number of people. I want to conclude then with one dire concern. Public education is still the main activity that unites all of us together as Americans in a common cause, a common purpose. Its importance in this regard has certainly, though, been eroded over the last 35 years. The end of school desegregation, which was clearly a national project, has lessened that concern about public education. The growing number of students attending charter schools, using vouchers to go to private schools, has simply reduced the number of people who have a vested interest in public schools. And if parents are in control of their child's education through opt-outs, why should members of the public pay for education at all? Wouldn't it simply make more sense to only provide limited financial support to low-income students and let the rest fend for themselves? After all, taxes for public schools account for half of state and local taxes. So in short, this opinion, along with several others by the court, will further the dividing of American society into separate, distinct groups that do not really feel like they have much in common anymore. And that is a very long-term problem that all of us will have to deal with. Thank you. Oh, well.
In 1790, George Washington, who was then in his second year as president, wrote the following: "The citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind an example of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike the liberty of conscience." To whom did he say that? Was it to majoritarian Anglicans? Was it to plurality Presbyterians or Methodists or Puritans? No, none of those. It was to a politically powerless minority immigrant Faith Community, the Jewish congregation at Newport, Rhode Island. And in our discussion together tonight, I'd like to consider together whether that enlarged and liberal policy continues today. I'll argue that religious pluralism and toleration are positive goods that are protected by the Constitution, illustrated by 249 years of American history, and that they represent sound policy. And for those reasons, at the end of this debate, I'll ask that you vote no on the debated proposition. Now, before we begin on the substance of my remarks, I'd like to pause briefly to introduce our counterparts on the other side of this proposition. Professor Brown, from whom you've just heard, joined the University of South Carolina School of Law in 2022. His research focuses on race, law, and education, and the global impact of the African American struggle. He's published over 80 articles or comments on issues including critical race theory, school desegregation, and more. Prior to joining the law school here, Professor Brown taught at Indiana University Marrer School of Law. He earned his law degree from Yale Law School, and before that, a bachelor's degree in accounting from Indiana University, which means he is one of, perhaps the only person in the room adept at math. His debating partner, Denise Strickland, is a second-year law student here at the University of South Carolina School of Law. She's an editor of the South Carolina Law Review, an officer in the Public Interest Law Society and the Pro Bono Board, and a member of the Health Law Society. She's earned a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's in secondary science education, a master's degree in speech pathology from UNC, has taught in the United States and Nicaragua, and currently is a practicing acute care speech-language pathologist, which, though the introduction doesn't say this, probably means she is perhaps the only person in the room fluent in the International Phonetic Alphabet, the IPA. Please join me in welcoming and thanking them for their participation tonight. In the time we've got left together in my opening remarks here, I'd like to group my thoughts into three primary categories or headings. First is the context in which this proposition arises. Second, the merits of why I think the Supreme Court was correct in its ruling in Mahmoud, and that tolerating and accommodating religious dissenters, including in public schools, is the right and constitutional result. And third, if time allows, a response to some of the arguments that Professor Brown has raised already. First, let's put some context around this admittedly and I think intentionally broad and some might say vague proposition. We're not at the USC School of Political Theory. We're not here debating in a vacuum of concepts aspirationally like inclusivity and religious sensitivity or toleration. We live in the United States of America, a constitutional republic. We have a constitution that governs our land. And we're here especially, in particular, context precipitated by the Supreme Court's decision in Mahmoud v. Taylor. I know we already heard briefly about it, but I want to add a little bit of detail and context that I think will support and flavor the rest of our discussion. Montgomery County, Maryland, is one of the largest, wealthiest, and most diverse counties in the United States. Its school district is one of the largest in the United States, with approximately 160,000 students and a recent annual budget of $3 billion. Montgomery County consistently ranks in the top 5 counties in the nation in terms of per capita population of Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, and only 56% of households in Montgomery County, Maryland, speak English as their primary language at home. Again, a diverse ethnic and religious milieu of students and families and community members. That school district has long had an official policy of religious accommodation and inclusivity. And until the events giving rise to the case that we're here to discuss tonight, it was the long-standing policy of that school district to allow students to opt out on religious bases from nearly any aspect of the curriculum that they or their parents wish to opt out of. In fact, that's a fairly common policy across the United States. The state of Hawaii, for example, has a statewide mandate that students can opt out on religious bases from any part of the curriculum that they need to, that substantially burdens their religious beliefs. Every state has some version of it. Now, in some states, it's limited to the Family and Reproductive Health Unit, but in many states and school districts, as already mentioned, it's broader than that. All that changed in the 2022 to 23 school year when Montgomery County, Maryland school board members decided they wanted to introduce a number of new books, curriculum, and initiatives to foster greater inclusivity of LGBTQ members of the community and the school district. 13 books were chosen by the school district. The litigation in the case focused on 5 of them that were intended for use in the kindergarten through 5th grade student population. In response to these books being introduced into the curriculum, many parents of a broad variety of different ethnicities and faith communities requested that their children be opted out of those particular storybook lessons. In response, the school district did not reconsider the way it was implementing the materials or the materials they were implementing, but instead decided to eliminate its long-standing opt-out policy. In response, thousands of parents petitioned the school board, attended school board meetings, but the school board declined to alter course. Litigation followed. In Justice Alito's majority opinion, he summarizes the 5 books. I won't take the time to do it tonight, but his point was, and I think you would agree if you read them or looked at the excerpts in the majority opinion, they were certainly normative. They were, by the school district's own admission, intended to disrupt students' thinking about issues of gender and sexuality. That's the context in which this case arose, in which the good of inclusivity that the board sought to foster was pitted against the ability of religious minority faiths to opt out of those materials. That's the context. Now let me pick up the pace a little bit because time is fleeting. Let me move to the second heading, why I believe that Mahmoud was rightly decided. 4 subpoints: text, precedent, history, and sound policy. Let's start with the text. The First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause, we've already seen it on the screen. That's an enumerated right, one that the federal government and through incorporation, states and local governments cannot infringe upon. Inclusivity, I think we would all agree, I hope we would, and I'm sure all 4 of us up here today would agree, is a good. It is a good thing. It is an affirmative good that we should wish to foster. But it's not an enumerated right. And in a conflict between enumerated rights and aspirational values in our constitutional system, the enumerated right must prevail. Add in a fundamental right of parents to control the education and upbringing of their children, and again, that is going to carry the day. Beyond text, we can look at precedent. Many decades of precedent have allowed people to opt out of government-mandated activities, including in the school context, on the basis of religious beliefs. Professor Brown already mentioned briefly West Virginia versus Barnett. That case was brought on a free exercise basis. Now, admittedly, I'll agree that the court's analysis does speak often in free speech clause language. But the case was brought as a free exercise case. Woolley versus Maynard, 1977. George Maynard, who I had the privilege of representing a few years ago, objected on the basis of his faith to the live free or die license plate. And again, the Supreme Court let him opt out. Now again, that was free speech. That was a compelled speech case. But the point being that in a number of contexts, consistently over decades, religious believers, religious objectors, have been allowed to opt out on First Amendment grounds when so compelled by their faith. And then, of course, Wisconsin versus Yoder. The Supreme Court allowed Amish to opt out of high school entirely, not out of a class, not out of a 20-minute storybook episode, completely to opt out of high school on the basis of their religious beliefs. That's precedent. History. From the founding era to today, our history and tradition is full of examples of religious opt-outs, including at times when the stakes were much higher than they are here today. Take just one example, conscientious objection to military service. In the American Revolution, when our nation's nascent existence was on the line, when every hand, every man was needed, and when conscientious objection certainly was not in vogue, Quakers were allowed to opt out of mandatory military service. So too in every conflict since then. And finally, the fourth reason I believe Mahmoud was rightly decided, it's sound policy. Again, no one up here opposes inclusivity. It's good. We should aspire to it. But religious toleration and accommodation are inclusive. The parents in Mahmoud didn't try or want to change the curriculum. The court's opinion didn't require or even permit that. They didn't remove the storybooks. They didn't try to force their religious beliefs on anyone. They simply wanted to be informed and permitted to be excused from discrete portions of instruction. At the risk of eating up too much of my time, if on the policy basis that still feels a little uncomfortable to you, try to reverse the polarities. Imagine if instead of Montgomery County, Maryland, and LGBTQ-themed materials, imagine we were talking about a school in, let's say, Florida or Texas. Let's pick Florida, where schools, as part of their social studies or heritage curriculum, required each week students to watch a video by, let's say, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, or from the White House, talking about immigration and advancing the administration's views on immigration. Now, there are certainly Americans who have argued in court that they have a religious belief contrary to that they have a religious belief that they should be hospitable, welcoming, and accommodating of strangers, foreigners, and aliens. And if on that basis those parents didn't want their children to sit through the video lesson by the Secretary of DHS or Ron DeSantis and wanted to opt their kids out, does that feel different to you? If it does, perhaps it should feel the same here when the polarities are reversed. I've got just a few minutes left. Let me respond briefly to a few of Professor Brown's points. One of his arguments was that at the time Yoder was decided, and in prior eras of American history, we didn't have the same type and degree of religious diversity that we have today. To be honest, I'm not sure if or whether that's accurate, but more importantly, I don't think it matters. Firstly, from the founding era to today, protections of the First Amendment, doctrinally, were expressly intended to protect minority groups. No matter what specific minority groups they were or how commonly represented they were, doctrinally the point remains. They were intended to protect against majoritarian principles. And I think there have been a broad array of religious minorities in the nation from its inception. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, once wrote, "No person, papists, Jews, Turks, or Indians, should be disturbed at their worship." Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Neither pagan nor Mohammedan nor Jew shall be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of their religion." John Leland, the famous Baptist minister of the colonial era, wrote, "If a man merits the confidence of his neighbors, whether he worships one God, 20 gods, or no God, be he Jew, Turk, pagan, or infidel, he is eligible to any office of the state." For 249 years, religious minorities, as they were recently in Mahmoud, have been entitled to accommodation and toleration. A second argument that Professor Brown made was that Mahmoud will allow religious parents to opt children out of all kinds of things, evolution, civil rights, etc. First, and I say this charitably, I think it's unwarranted and frankly a little insulting to believe that people of faith will employ the opt-out right in a pretextual, bigoted, or overly expansive way. People of faith, in the same way as your local school board, perhaps even more so, want their children to be well-educated, widely exposed to ideas, including objective ideas and materials with which they disagree, so long as they are not, in the words of Justice Alito, undeniably normative and intended by the school to disrupt their beliefs. Lastly, the argument, and this was echoed not only in Professor Brown's comments, but in Justice Jackson's dissent, that such opt-outs could be unworkable. They could be overwhelming. Again, I find it hard to believe, particularly when Montgomery County, Maryland has long had the very opt-out policy, or effectively the same opt-out policy that the Supreme Court now requires, when the state of Hawaii has the same opt-out policy, and when school districts across the country have similar opt-out policies. I'll read again from President Washington's letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island in conclusion. He wrote, "May the Father of all mercies make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." I'd submit to you that this exhortation is still true today, and for the reasons I've explained, I urge you to vote no on the proposition this evening. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. This is a big old crowd. First, I would like to say thank you to the Lincoln Douglas Society for the invitation. I'm going to be picking up on some of the themes that have already been covered, but hopefully from a unique angle. And an additional note, the books at issue are referred to as LGBTQ+ inclusive, and I will refer to them that way for consistency. The first thing I want to say is that if you are interested in these issues, and I'm assuming you're here because you are, I would like to ask that you investigate these further, because as I was learning about this, I realized that the legal complexities and implications of this decision are far too numerous for us to address in this debate. These issues include, but are not limited to, what the government's obligations are once it elects to provide a public good, such as public education, whether and under what conditions we can impose limits on that public good, whether a family's financial constraints impacting access to educational alternatives is relevant to these questions, how the age of the students impacts our analysis, and what preconceived notions we have regarding how children of different ages receive and integrate information and social norms, what rights do the children have as opposed to the parents in terms of free exercise of religion, free association, and access to ideas, and the host of other topics that I do agree with Mr. Coleman that parents want their children to be educated, but this does open us up to challenges on other topics that could be considered hostile to a parent's faith, such as evolution, climate change, myths and holidays, vaccination and blood transfusion, feminism. There's a whole host of topics that could be challenged under this doctrine. Obviously, that's a lot to cover, and we can't possibly address it all and try to convince you to vote for our side of the proposition. So first, I'm not going to try to change your mind about the proposition, because I agree with Professor Brown. I feel like that's a value judgment. So what I want to tackle is the reasoning that the majority used to arrive at their decision to grant the parents an injunction, and why I found that reasoning concerning, and how these two ideas, inclusivity and free exercise of religion, need not be in conflict. So, a little bit of history that I had to learn to make sense of this case. Prior to this decision, the Supreme Court has held that compelling a student to declare a belief contrary to their own religious views is a violation of their right to free exercise. That's the Barnett case that's been referenced. Short of such an affirmative compulsion, the court has held that exposure to ideas that conflict with one's religious beliefs doesn't rise to the level of coercion, such as when the court held in Kentucky v. Bremerton School District that students being exposed to a coach's prayer at a school-sponsored sporting event didn't violate the Establishment Clause. As the majority explained in Mahmoud, the first consideration in an analysis of whether a student's free exercise has been violated is typically decided according to the standards set forth in Employment Division v. Smith, in which the court held that the government can place incidental burdens on religious exercise as long as the burden is neutral to any specific religion and generally applied. Under that test, the introduction of LGBTQ+ inclusive books into a school curriculum would likely survive a challenge such as the one presented here. The books don't target any particular religion. The parents bringing suit are in fact Ukrainian Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim. And the books are used in the same way as the other 80 to 90 approved texts per grade level. In other words, exposing all students to books including characters and ideas that may be objectionable according to any particular parent's religious beliefs would be neutral, and exposure to the ideas alone wouldn't rise to the level of coercion. Therefore, according to that precedent, participating in the curriculum, including the LGBTQ plus inclusive books, would not violate a student's right to free exercise of religion. However, and this is why this case is interesting, the court made the pointed decision to proceed differently, and they relied heavily on a case that was previously considered an exception to the general rule. In Wisconsin v. Yoder, which we've heard about, the court held that a group of Amish families had the right to remove their teenage children from public education entirely because mandatory school attendance substantially interfered with the religious development of the children and created, and I'm going to put this in quotes because these are not my words and they come up again, a very real threat of undermining. So that's not a derogatory gesture. I just want to get that language. The religious beliefs the parents were attempting to teach their children. Yoder was recognized as an exception to Smith because the neutral, generally applicable compulsory education laws affirmatively compelled the parents to send their children away to school when their religion dictated that they be integrated into the Amish community at home. This exception is consistent with the Supreme Court's previous line between exposure and compulsion. In Mahmoud, the court used the Yoder exception to Smith to apply the very real threat of undermining test in a much broader context, thus bypassing the neutral and generally applied question entirely. This is a much easier showing on the part of parents who can now challenge school curriculum based on a claim that the curriculum conflicts with their religious beliefs and poses the very real threat of undermining the religious education of their children. Hence, the potential application for the ability of schools to expose children to a wide range of ideas mentioned above. So what do we do about this? If this is to be the new test used to determine on what grounds a parent can challenge school curriculum, we must ask whether it's possible to expose students to ideas that conflict with parents' beliefs, or if all such exposure automatically rises to the level of threat. So basically, if this is the test, how do we know when we've met it? This question is surprisingly complex, and I will illustrate with an example. The court stated that the determination of whether a given law or policy substantially interferes with the religious development of a child will be fact-intensive. In this case, the majority opinion pointed out that the LGBTQ plus inclusive books are being presented to elementary school children by trusted authority figures, teachers like me, so trust me, and are normative in nature. In this case, the court defines normative as meaning, direct quote, clearly designed to present certain values and beliefs as things to be celebrated and certain contrary values and beliefs as things to be rejected. One book, and I have pictures, one book, because the pages were cited by both the majority and the dissent, is Uncle Bobby's Wedding, intended for 5th grade children who are typically around 10 to 11 years old. Give me 1 second here. He already taught me how to do this, so let's see if I disappoint him. All right. So in Uncle Bobby's Wedding, Chloe has a very close relationship with her Uncle Bobby. They do a lot of activities together. And at one point, there is a summer picnic where Uncle Bobby and Jamie announce that they are getting married. And everyone's so excited, except for Chloe. And then this is how Chloe's mom explains why people get married. Bobby and Jamie love each other, said Mommy. When grown-up people love each other that much, sometimes they get married. Okay? The majority states that this presents a specific, if subtle, message about marriage. The book does not simply refer to same-sex marriage as an existing practice. It presents acceptance of same-sex marriage as a perspective that should be celebrated. All right, but let's read the book again. Chloe is very close to her uncle. All right, he announces that he's going to get married. What if Jamie were a woman? Chloe's still pretty sad. And then Mom explains that sometimes when people love each other, they get married. All right? So the question is, if Chloe is jealous because she thinks Uncle Bobby will spend less time with her, then is the gender of his partner relevant to the story? Is this a book with a subtle message about the acceptance of same-sex marriage, or is it a book about childhood jealousy and a growing family in which the married couple happens to be of the same sex? To put this in additional perspective, according to the Montgomery County Classroom Textbook Order List, each grade level between kindergarten and 5th grade has 80 to 90 approved supplementary texts. And as we've discussed, 13 LGBTQ plus inclusive books spread across those grade levels was added to the curriculum. Presumably, most of the other depictions of marriage within the supplementary texts present many examples of happy opposite-sex married couples, maybe some divorced couples or other extended families. Uncle Bobby's Wedding is normative in that it exposes students to a single example of a happy same-sex couple. But that begs the question, does one book pose a threat? Does 13? What does exposure without threat look like? Also, notably, the alternative to a normative text is one that is descriptive, so would teach children directly about things like same-sex marriage. That could include something like a history text that describes the national legal recognition of same-sex marriage. Would that type of direct instruction also be a threat? We don't have an answer to that based on this decision. But we're now in a world where we are uncertain as to how broadly this new test applies and when exposure to an idea rises to the level of threat. How do we get out of this conundrum? How do we find a way forward? I think the answer actually lies in the Montgomery County curriculum. All right, this is my last visual. So this is from another book from Mahmoud, and the majority opinion cites the curriculum guide, and the student says he can't be a boy if he was born a girl, and the teacher's told to respond, that comment is hurtful. However, in the full text of the guide, the student says, that's weird, he can't be a boy if he was born a girl. And the teacher is told to reply, that comment is hurtful, we shouldn't use negative words to talk about people's identities. The guide addresses the impact of a potentially hurtful comment and acknowledges the difficulty the speaking student is having. Inclusivity in schools makes space for both realities and experiences at the same time, with both students exposed to the ideas and existence of the other. In fact, the curriculum guide even goes so far as to specify that the aim is not to change the student's religious beliefs. But inclusivity itself, as expressed in the curriculum guide, offers us a possible solution. So I'm going to end with a quote from the curriculum guide. A student might say something like, being gay, lesbian, queer, etc., is wrong and not allowed in my religion. The teacher can respond with, I understand that is what you believe, but not everyone believes that. We don't have to understand or support a person's identity to treat them with respect and kindness. School is a place where we learn to work together regardless of our differences. In any community, we'll always find people with beliefs different from our own, and that's okay. We can still show them respect. So with that quote, I will end and ask that you consider voting yes for inclusivity.
Gonna do a little mic check. Anyone on the back, if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. Seeing lots of thumbs. Thank you. First off, thank you to Professor Brown for the warm introduction. You may not know this, but Professor Brown was my 1L torts professor many moons ago, so this is a cool full circle moment for me. Thank you to also to the Lincoln Doug Society for inviting me to participate. I'm just so grateful to be here today, standing next to three very accomplished speakers, and it's a great honor. I'd like to extend a special thank you to my partner Miles Coleman for his help in preparing, to God above for the opportunity, and to my wife, family, and friends for their support and encouragement. Now on to the proposition. A welcoming classroom should never come at the cost of animus towards religious beliefs. While inclusivity is often a valuable goal, if it means forcing parents to choose between public education and raising their children in their religious tradition, then it becomes the opposite of inclusive. It becomes selective, ideological, and exclusive. The free exercise of religious beliefs and the passing down of those beliefs from parent to child has shaped American history since the beginning and continues to be central to the moral framework of this nation today. To disregard this religious tradition in the name of some modern inclusivity is to deny one of the oldest and most constitutionally protected freedoms in our country. Religious families are not being merely sensitive towards the inclusion of certain ideologies. They're standing firm in their worldview, standing firm in beliefs that they know to be determinative of their salvation, an issue that to them far transcends the political whims of modern society. And all that religious sensitivity really asks here is that parents simply be kept in the loop on their child's education and have a say in it. The court in Mahmoud understood these things, and tonight I would ask that you follow suit and vote no to the proposition. But if we're going to decide whether inclusivity of new modern ideas should override the sanctity of religious freedoms, we must first look at the crucial role that religion has played in American history. Simply put, we can't tell the story of America without religious values. From the Puritans and Pilgrims to the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, to Reverend King and the Civil Rights Movement, from the Cold War stand against an atheist communist Soviet Union to present-day prison reform, homeless shelters, and various charities. The foundation of all these things is the same: transcendent morals and values rooted in something bigger than ourselves. More than just privately held beliefs, religious values have been and continue to be an undeniable force for public good in our country. And who better to pass those values down from generation to generation than parents? We have long understood this in America, which is why historically public education rarely extended beyond the elementary subjects. It was understood that the parents, as part of their primary duty to educate, would teach them everything else, including a moral and religious worldview that they saw fit. But now, through forced inclusivity of brand new social ideologies in our public schools, we are attempting to deny all deference to that deeply rooted tradition of parental discretion. How long before we lose all the good that has accompanied it? Now, while inclusivity can be a worthy goal, it should not come at the expense of the moral character and traditions of this nation. Time is often a strong measurement of successful ideas, and if the protection of parents' religious freedom to bring their children up accordingly hasn't proven its worth over the last 249 years, then I ask, what has? To quote a great universal truth we all know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Historically and overwhelmingly, our courts have agreed. As Miles so eloquently laid out for us, the right of parents to raise their children in accordance with their faith has continuously prevailed in the face of state intervention. As Yoder and now Mahmoud tell us, the First Amendment Free Exercise Clause guarantees those rights. Additionally, the Supreme Court has reminded us that children are not merely creatures of the state, but that the custody, care, and nurture of the child reside first in the parents, whose primary function and freedom include preparation for obligations the state can neither supply nor hinder. This parental liberty, as stated by the court, is, quote, perhaps the oldest of the fundamental liberty interests recognized, end quote. So clearly then, a school curriculum that seeks to educate on secular ideas that are antithetical to many religions, without allowing for any deference to those religions, directly burdens and unconstitutionally interferes with the parents' fundamental rights. And if protecting these rights is labeled sensitive, then I think we should all be a little overly sensitive. And let's not forget who we're really talking about here: children. Children, especially the younger children in kindergarten through 5th grade, are extremely impressionable. You might disagree and say that these children have the freedom to make informed decisions on their own, and that the school is merely equipping them with all the facts. But what about the 6, 7, or 8-year-olds, being taught that doctors guess people's gender at birth and sometimes get it wrong? That the institution of marriage is merely just what some grown-ups do when they feel like they love each other? These young children can barely tie their shoes, ride a bike, or pick out their own clothes in the morning. yet we assume they can digest these complex ideological claims and meaningfully reflect upon them? That is an absurd expectation. The reality is they will take the material they're taught in school and accept it as true because their teacher, who they trust, told them so. I'm certain that none of us here as kids seriously challenged that the sky is blue, that 2 + 2 = 4, that A comes before B. In fact, the entire point of kindergarten through 5th grade is to make sure we accepted these things as true. So when schools introduce topics on gender identity, sexuality, etc., to elementary students and present them in ways that go against the religious worldview of so many, they're not just passively informing or equipping, they're actively shaping beliefs. That's not inclusion, that's indoctrination, and it results in the total exclusion of religious families who may disagree. But who does this really place the most significant burden on? The families. Realistically, there are two alternatives for parents in the face of forced inclusion of anti-religious values. One, endure the significant financial strain of putting their child in private school or homeschool. Or two, remove their child from school and face the legal consequences of compulsory education laws and forfeit their child's education in totem. Put more succinctly by our very own Judge Quattlebaum in his dissent of this case at the Fourth Circuit, the forced inclusion of these topics forces the parents to make a choice. Either adhere to their faith, which is paramount to all, to them, or receive a free public education for their children. This sad dichotomy could not ring truer for anyone than it does for the financially poor religious parents who simply cannot afford private or homeschool alternatives. And to add, this sacrifice only becomes more severe for parents with children with learning or developmental disabilities, who often require the accommodations and resources that only public school systems can provide. So if we want to talk seriously about inclusivity, then let's at least be consistent. It's not very inclusive to force the financially poor, with no realistic alternatives, to sacrifice the religious upbringing of their children just to access basic school education. That's not freedom, nor justice, nor equity. That is coercion. But it need not be this way, and in fact, as Miles has pointed out for us, has not ever been this way. Contrary to the assertions of the opposition, Mahmoud is not going to cause the sky to fall. Rather than make new radical assertions, the court in Mahmoud simply recognized the sound legal foundations of laws that are already on the books in all 50 states and in D.C. These states have long recognized that with the right accommodations and attitudes, we can forgo burdening the rights and the exclusion of religious communities. For example, the laws of 47 states and D.C. already provide parents discretion as to whether their child will be taught sexual education. The other 3 states leave the issue to localities, which generally follow the same opt-out policies. Many states have taken these opt-outs even further, Hawaii being an example, rightfully allowing them outside of the scope of sexual education. Specifically, these states either, 1, require notice to parents of certain topics in their child's curriculum, 2, allow parents to review the proposed curriculum and materials, or 3, allow for a child's partial or total opt-out of that instruction if the parent so chooses. And most of these states require a combination of these options. So it really wouldn't be some new strain on schools to allow opt-outs based on religious beliefs, as the opposition has suggested. It would simply be the utilization of a structure that every state in this country has already established. And I might add, if we're going to allow administrative difficulties to get in the way of our deeply rooted constitutional rights, then we need to seriously reevaluate our priorities in this country. Now, in conclusion, inclusivity, while a good thing, should not be a Trojan horse for ideology. When schools elevate one worldview at the expense of another, it is not education, but instead indoctrination. Inclusivity without religious accommodation is simply exclusion in disguise. If public schools are truly for all Americans, they must respect religious beliefs as a core part of that inclusivity, not as a casualty of it. Allowing opt-outs parental notice is not a rejection of inclusivity, but instead a necessary balance in a pluralistic society. Forcing parents to forfeit the religious upbringing of their children just to access basic education is not freedom, it is coercion. Therefore, we must protect the sacred right of families to raise their children according to religious convictions, especially in the face of public education policies that would degrade it. And for these reasons, I urge you to vote no to tonight's proposition. Thank you.
My understanding is now we're into rebuttal, and I'm going to reserve, let's say, the last 2 minutes, so I'll take 4 minutes. There are a few points I want to rebut. So the first one, I think I can speak loud enough without this thing. Okay. The couple points I want to rebut, but let me first start with the age appropriateness of the students. This case really dealt with kids who were in elementary school, not kids who were in high school. And one could make an argument that I would certainly be willing to listen to, that younger kids shouldn't be exposed to material that we would expose older kids to. That to me seems to make a lot of sense. But I'm a lawyer. I'm a law professor. I have absolutely no knowledge about child psychology and child development. If that is going to be a way that we want to talk about this, it's better for the experts who know about child psychology to address it than the legal system. And I think that's exactly what you get when you let these kinds of decisions be made by school officials as opposed to being made by courts. The second is on the extensiveness of this right. Sure, if this is just a minor right, if this is just a few people taking an opt-out, it's not that significant. Why worry about it? Let me go home. But the Supreme Court delivers this opinion at the very end of June, when they deliver all of their major opinions. And the reason this is a major opinion, and we don't know how cabined this is going to be, because we've got to send it out there and see what happens through litigation. And you heard opposing counsel talk about thousands of people who were prepared to object when this was debated by the school board, suggesting that we may be talking about a significant, no, that's not the right word, gargantuan number of potential legal claims coming to our court systems. And imagine what that means for our school systems. They're going to be overwhelmed trying to litigate these kind of claims. They'll certainly excise as much material that seems to be controversial in order to reduce their legal fees and the disruptive aspect of education in general. But I think I'm going to now go into what seems to me to be an underlying concept here that's probably the more fundamental critical point. Montgomery County spent $3.6 billion to educate its kids at $23,000 per child. That money comes from the taxpayers. So there's a fundamental difference here. Who should be in charge of public education? Should it be the parents or should it be the taxpayers? Now, as a taxpayer, I pay money for public education because it's a public good. It is something that will help all of us in society. I am not paying money to public education for the single purpose of raising other people's children. That's their responsibility. That's their obligation. So when they cross over into public school, they're crossing over into an institution that's for the public's good. So that the concept of inclusivity, I think it's very clear. These religious parents who objected to this material would not have defined the LGBTQ community as a part of their inclusive community. We have to define everyone as part of our inclusive community, and our public schools need to do the same. We'll stop there. That's my 4 minutes.
All right. I want to zoom in and then zoom back out. First, to zoom in because, as the majority recognized in Mahmoud, these cases of this sort, are fact-intensive. They're fact-dependent. Now, the proposition before you tonight isn't dependent on a particular set of facts. It is broadly stated. But I think some facts help flavor that. So first, let me zoom in. I just want to give you 2 examples. These are lifted directly from the Mahmoud majority opinion, in which young children were affirmatively taught that gender is subjective and changeable and unrelated to biological sex. Now, you may believe that, you may not believe that, you may have strong feelings about it, or you may be agnostic about it. But the fact is there are people, including the plaintiffs in this case, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and others, who do have strong feelings about it. For example, not in one of the texts, but in the discussion guide, the teachers were mandated to present the material to the students. They were taught to tell students, at any point in our lives, and I'm quoting, we can choose to identify with one gender, multiple genders, or neither gender. In another instance, the teachers were instructed to tell the children, when we're born, people make a guess about our gender and label us boy or girl based on our body parts. Sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're wrong. Now again, you might agree with that, you might disagree with it, you might not care. The point in this case was there were parents who did care. Taxpayers too, and parents who did care, and it was contrary to the beliefs they wanted to instill in their children. That's the zooming in, because I think it matters. Now let's zoom back out. 2 points when we zoom out. First, we've heard, I think correctly, that this case, like any blockbuster case, if you want to call it that, leaves certain elements undecided. There's going to be decades of litigation to sort it out. Y'all, that's true in every big case. When District of Columbia versus Heller, the first Second Amendment case to be decided in centuries, was decided, it's when I was in law school, so it's been a while, 2008 maybe, I don't know the year of it exactly, but around that. The Supreme Court for the first time recognized a constitutional right incorporated for people to bear arms. It's been decades of litigation to sort that one out. That's true of every case, and that's not necessarily a reason not to recognize a right, to memorialize right, or to reach a ruling. It's no mark against Mahmoud that it hasn't answered every question that could be asked. The second piece I want to talk about as we zoom out, again, is to put Mahmoud, and frankly, to put the proposition that we're here to talk about tonight in a broader, recent constitutional litigation context. And that is, over the past decade to 15 years, as our country, as our society, as our courts, and as our justices have tried to chart a path between inclusivity and accommodation for LGBTQ people and inclusivity and accommodation for people of traditional religious faiths. 4 cases I'll bring to your attention. Obergefell, the majority found a constitutional right nationwide to same-sex marriage. Bostock, the majority found that Title VII, Federal Civil Rights Employment Law, protections extend to transgender people. But the same court, a footnote, a few of the justices had changed, but it's in the same relative period of time, and many of the justices were the same. Let's not get hung up on the little detail. Effectively, the same court also concluded in Fulton versus City of Philadelphia that a Roman Catholic foster agency, licensed by the state, contracted by the state, funded by the state, could choose to work only with co-religionists, and in the facts of that case, not to affirm LGBTQ couples for foster care work. They had other options that could do that. And most recently in Mahmoud v. Taylor, which we've already talked about. What's the point I'm making? The Supreme Court, and again, culturally, nationally, all of us are trying collectively to chart a path where we can have both inclusivity and respect and tolerance for religious people. Can we have both of those things? Yes, we can. But will there be times when they come into conflict? There will. We've talked about a few of them. And when that happens, what should we do? That's the proposition before you. I'm not going to rehash everything I said earlier, but I'll try to land the plane in the minute and 15 seconds I've got left. When you've got two things that you're trying to have at the same time and they come into conflict, in our constitutional system, in Mahmoud, in the public school context, which one must yield? The enumerated right, the fundamental right to protect the free exercise and the upbringing and education of your children will prevail. Again, keep in mind, not against anyone else. The books are still being read. The curriculum is still being taught. Inclusivity is still being practiced. It's not a zero-sum game. Respecting and accommodating religious folk doesn't take away from the ability of the school district and the other non-objectors to do as they were doing before. But the religious objectors should be excused. In conclusion, let me read one more, once again, from George Washington's letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. He said to them, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. While everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." For those reasons, I would again urge and encourage you to vote no on the proposition.
Let me conclude this way. Our society is a society dedicated to individual self-determination. The individual has the right for he or she to decide for themselves what it is they want to do in life. We're dealing with children. We're not dealing with adults. Children are not capable of deciding for themselves. They have to go through a maturation process before they become full-fledged adults. This is exactly why the Supreme Court, up until Mahmoud, had taken a very different tack with respect to the rights of kids in public schools. Because the goal of public schools was to help train them up so that they would become these individual self-determining people. Part of the value set, and once again, let me go back to that. The United States Supreme Court, in numerous opinions, has said the fundamental purpose of of public education is the inculcation of fundamental values necessary for the maintenance of our society. We have everybody in public schools. We have our murderers, our future rapists, our future armed robbers in there. We have our future people who will assault LGBTQ individuals in the public schools. We pay a tremendous amount of money for public school education. The control of public school education is not to rest with the parents. The parents have 5/6 of the waking time of a child to influence the child any way that they want. We, the public, only have this 1/6 in public schools. What Mahmoud is doing is taking away even that 1/6 for a section of our population. Done. Well, Daniel, you don't get to come back in.